Good morning and welcome to the National Press Theatre. Avec nous ce matin, l'honorable Marc Garneau.
We have with us today the Honourable Marc Garneau, Minister of Transportation.
Joined by McCrory, as well as François Collins. As usual, we'll start with a few opening statements, and then we'll go to the question period. Mr. Garneau.
Thank you very much, and I'm sorry. We had new information to look at this morning. That is why I am late.
Before I begin, I would like to introduce my officials. I have with me today Aaron McCrory, who is the acting Assistant Deputy Minister for Safety and Security, and François Collins, who is the Associate Director of General Aviation, Civil Aviation. The tragic accident of the Ethiopian flight that occurred a few days ago has really touched the hearts of many, many Canadians, not only because it was such a tragic accident with 157 people who lost their lives, but also because 18 of them were Canadians. And in the last few days, we've all had the chance to get to know a little bit about those Canadians and the profiles that have been on television. And it's driven things home to us in a very personal way. And I know that very many Canadians have been very moved by the tributes to these Canadians and realize that this was a great loss for our country. So it is something that has really viscerally caught the attention of Canadians. My department, and in fact the entire aviation industry worldwide, is seized with the fatal crash on Sunday, March the 10th, involving an Ethiopian Airlines Boeing 737 MAX 8 in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and what we need to do now to address any possible resulting safety issues. After the accident, I convened Transport Canada civil aviation experts who consulted with the aviation industry, our international partners, and those who are actually flying aircraft to conduct an assessment of the operation of this particular aircraft. The advice they have provided is based on the information that they have been receiving, the requirements for new procedures and training for Boeing 737 MAX 8 and MAX 9 flight crews that we have already put in place here in Canada, and their own knowledge and expertise. The panel has been reviewing the latest data in real time, and I can assure you it's been occupying our time 100% for the past few days. As a result of new data that we received this morning and had the chance to analyze, and on the advice of my experts, and as a precautionary measure, I am issuing a safety notice. This safety notice restricts commercial passenger flights from any operator of the Boeing 737 MAX 8 or MAX 9 variant aircraft, whether domestic or foreign, from arriving, departing, or overflying Canadian airspace. This safety notice is effective immediately and will remain in place until further notice. The new information, and I hasten to say, this is new information that we received and analyzed this morning, comes from validated satellite tracking data suggesting a possible, although unproven, similarity in the flight profile of the Lion Air aircraft, and I caution that this new information is not conclusive and that we must await further evidence, hopefully from the voice and data recorders. As the investigations have just started, it is too soon to speculate about the exact cause of the accident in Addis Ababa and to make direct links to the Lion Air accident in Indonesia in October of 2018.
My department is closely following the investigations by the National Transportation Safety Board, the Federal Aviation administration and the Ethiopian Civil Aviation Authority. Following the accident in October 2018 involving a Boeing 737 MAX 8, Transport Canada immediately worked in cooperation with concerned Canadian operators, that is Air Canada, WestJet, and Sunwing, to resolve the security issue that was highlighted in the conclusions of the preliminary investigation following the Lion Air crash. Following this work, Canadian air operators were forced to establish new procedures and mandatory training for flight crews. These Canadian requirements for new procedures and training sought to protect against the risk identified, and they went above and beyond the measures directed by the United States Federal Aviation Administration and Boeing, and above and beyond what other nations have done. It is important to note that Canada has an enviable aviation safety record. There are two reasons for this. First of all, there is the professionalism and the safety-first focus of Canada's aviation industry. Those who design and manufacture aircraft, those who maintain them, our airports, our air traffic controllers, and of course those who operate and fly the aircraft. It is also due to the world-class knowledge, expertise, and relentless focus on safety by Transport Canada officials with whom I work, who are responsible for developing regulations and ensuring compliance with those regulations.
Officials continue to monitor the situation and work with international partners, including the investigation agencies and certifying authorities, to establish the conditions for the safe return to service. I will not hesitate to take swift action should we discover any additional safety issues. Canadians expect and are entitled to a safe transportation system today and for the future. I want them to be able to fly with confidence. Thank you very much, and you can take questions.
Ready for our question period. As usual, one question, one follow-up, please. Louis Bouin, Radio-Canada.
Mr. Garneau, do you think that this is more a question of public perception? That's what I see in your decision a bit today. The decision is based on new information that we received this morning, which we analyzed, and I believe that public perception about safety is based on the certainty that the department which represents transportation, that is Transport Canada, ensures their safety, and that it has professionals that base their decision on facts and analysis. I think that that is how Canadians would like to think about the professionalism of Transport Canada, and that is always how we have acted since the very beginning. And I've said since the beginning of this week that we will continue to gather in the necessary information before we make decisions, and that these decisions must be based on facts and credible information. And that is exactly what we did this morning. Canadian travelers, what impact could there be on the most common routes? And of course, the measures taken this morning are effective immediately. They will have to contact airlines with whom they had reservations to determine how they can change that reservation. And it's something that I know full well is inconvenient, and it's a significant inconvenience, but it's something that must be done for safety reasons, and I believe that Canadians expect us to take the necessary measures to protect their transportation safety. Julie Vaduzin, CBC.
Mr. Garneau, just so I'm clear, this safety notice, so you're grounding this plane. This plane is grounded?
What the notice is saying is that there can't be any MAX 8 or MAX 9 aircraft flying into, out of, or across Canada. So that obviously affects the Canadian MAX 8s that are owned by Air Canada, WestJet, and Sunwing, but it also has implications for airlines from outside the country that previous to this safety notice would have been able to fly in and out of the country.
So you were one of the few outliers in the whole world that was still allowing this to fly. So if you could be more specific about the new information that you've learned, and do you plan to share that with other countries, considering it's made you change your mind completely?
Well, we're happy to share that information with other countries because we're all in this together. The information has to do with satellite tracking data that is collected when certain aircraft take off, and it provides an indication of what their course is, but also their vertical profile and any fluctuations in that vertical profile. And my experts have looked at this and compared it to the flight that occurred with Lion Air 6 months ago in October. And there are, and I hasten to say, not conclusive, but there are similarities that sort of exceed a certain threshold in our minds with respect to the possible cause of what happened in Ethiopia. This is not conclusive, but it is something that points possibly in that direction, and at this point we feel that that threshold has been crossed, and that is why we are taking these measures.
Perfect. Lina Dib, La Presse Canadienne.
Lina Dib, Canadian Press. Yes, if I could just ask you to explain that in French. More simply for me, please. You said that you compared the Sunday's crash with the crash in October. Yes, the Lion Air flight in Indonesia. It's a comparison based on satellite tracking data that we received. It looks at the vertical profile and takeoff profile and the minutes after takeoff. And it's information that was validated and which demonstrates not only in which direction the flight is going, but it is able to measure vertical fluctuations in the aircraft's trajectory. And there are some similarities between the two profiles. They're not conclusive because there are still a lot of hypotheses about the precise cause of the crash, but it shows a certain similar profile, which led us to decide that it was appropriate to take the measures that I am announcing this morning. And you needed this to make your decision. There were a number of countries that made their decisions faster. Can you explain why was there the delay? Was there pressure from the Americans or for the company? Why did you take longer? Well, let me respond to you by saying that I'm now putting on my engineer hat and not my politician's hat, and my former astronaut's hat as well. And the reality is that when an incident occurs, we need to know exactly what has happened before we jump to conclusions or before we are influenced by our emotions or politics. We need to precisely analyze what happened. And I have said from the very beginning, what happened this morning is that we were given new information that we analyzed, and I said in any case that as soon as we had information that steered us in a certain direction, we would take that direction. And today we decided that given the comparison with the previous flight, based on the information we received this morning, it was prudent to make this decision. So we have always respected our approach, our professional approach, I believe, concerning the analysis of this accident.
Hi, Minister. I've got a question about rail safety. The Rail Safety Act review came last spring. It recommended that you provide more information than PD 36 does. It's almost been a year since then. We haven't seen more information forthcoming, that there's a risk that people will lose faith in the railways. Is that acceptable, or are we going to see more info on what's actually on rail cars?
Well, we believe that we are sharing information, as you know, every 3 months with first responders in different communities about what kind of traffic of dangerous goods has passed through those communities in the preceding 3 months, so that they, and we continuously do this, so that they are in a position to know, in the event that a derailment or an incident occurred in their community, what kind of products would likely be carried by that train. And of course, there are other processes in place to, if that kind of situation occurs, to provide them immediately with all of the details of what's in every single train compartment.
And just going beyond the first responders, there's a concern that people don't know what's going through their own communities.
Yeah, and so we have to balance this with the fact that you know, carrying certain products has to be kept to some extent secure, so that there is not a precise and advertised knowledge of every single product that's in every train crossing the country. There are a lot of products, and some of that is sensitive information. So we have to balance it with our requirement, obviously, to provide the necessary information to first responders.
Katie, CBC.
Hi, my question to you is, when did you tell the Americans that you would be making this decision, given that it was just Canada and the United States flying the bulk of these planes as of this morning? When did you tell the Americans, and how did that conversation go? So
we notified them this morning that we had decided to take that decision, and not very long ago, and so they are now aware of it. And we have been working very closely with them through Secretary Chow's office, and obviously my team at Transport Canada with the FAA and the NTSB. So it's been a very close link. They are, in fact, the certifying authority, the FAA, and so they are very much involved in investigating, along with the NTSB and the Ethiopian Civil Aviation Agency. But because of that very close contact, there have been numerous calls to Secretary Chow's office, and this morning her office was notified that we had taken the decision about the safety notice that I just told you about.
I was speaking with a former transport minister who described to me that this kind of decision would be absolutely devastating for Air Canada. Did Air Canada, Sunwing, or WestJet give your office any pushback when you came to your decision?
So we have been in touch with Air Canada, with WestJet and Sunwing throughout this whole process, and I would describe the situation as being no pushback this morning when we made them aware of this.
Hélène Buzetti, Le Devoir.
They realize the importance of safety.
Hélène Buzetti, Mr. Minister, you didn't quite answer my colleague's question when she asked if there was political pressure from the Americans. Obviously, the air industry is very important. Did the U.S. lobby Canada to not make the decision you're making this morning? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. When we're talking about air safety, there's no political pressure that comes into play. It's much too important to focus on safety when we're talking about the possibility of people's lives being at issue. A very different question, but a more technical one. You said that what convinced you to make this decision is a similarity to another crash 6 months ago. But what conclusions must we draw from the similarity, the fact that there are these similarities? What does that lead us to believe about the recurring problem with this aircraft? Well, as you know, with the Indonesian flight, there was an angle of attack sensor which measured the angle of the aircraft, and the information from this thing, which was not used, was provided to the computer software. It said that the nose of the aircraft was too high and it needed to drop because it could lose control. So the automatic system came into play and forced the nose of the aircraft down. And what happened in the case of the Lion Air flight in Indonesia is that the pilot was fighting against the computer software, which wanted to drop the nose of the aircraft. And then the software said, no, it's too high, and was forcing it down again. And eventually, there was a loss of control of the aircraft. So if we look at the profile, there are vertical fluctuations in the vertical profile of the aircraft, and there were similarities with what we saw. But I would repeat once again, this is not the proof that it is the same root problem. It could be something else, and we need to wait to see the data. And we hear the voices on the recorders, the black boxes that were found, to have more information.
Previous answer in English on the political consequences here?
The political, you mean whether there was any political pressure?
Yeah, the question that you just answered in French a short time ago about any sort of political pressure from the Americans around this. We know Donald Trump's very protective of Boeing.
There was absolutely no political pressure. We worked together, and we worked together on a whole host of subjects, and security and safety are always paramount in our dealings with each other. So absolutely none whatsoever.
TV?
That being said, though, the FAA's most recent statement still says that there's no evidence to ground this plane, and also that no civil aviation authorities from any other countries have come up with significant evidence that would warrant grounding the plane. So have you shared the Canadian evidence gathered with satellite imagery to American authorities?
We are certainly willing to share that information. It's information that we received from an organization, and yes, we work with other countries and we share information with them. Some of them may have also received it very recently, and so I can't speak to who has this information, but we received it overnight, looked at it this morning, and made our decision.
How will this affect Canadian air travel? Will there be cancellations? Will there be delays? Will there need to be refunds? How much chaos will we see at the airports because of this decision by the Canadian government?
So when a decision is made, such as this one, which is a major decision affecting one class of aircraft, obviously there were flights planned for today, and in subsequent days there are 41 of these aircraft in the country, although Sunwing had announced that it was not going to be flying its aircraft, not for safety reasons, but for commercial reasons. Yes, there is some disruption, and it's unfortunate, but we must put safety at the top of the agenda. It has to be paramount in our considerations. And Canadians who have flights booked on the MAX 8 will have the opportunity in speaking with the airlines, and the airlines have been very understanding up to this point in dealing with this situation. There will be some disruption. There's no question about that, and hopefully we'll be able to resolve this issue in the coming weeks and get the MAX 8 back up and flying. But for the moment, caution has to dominate.
Alex Boutillier, Toronto Star.
Hi, Minister. Has anything in the course of your investigation into this given you a reason to revisit the exemption to the head injury criterion that these aircrafts have, both for Air Canada and WestJet?
You're talking about the seat structure? No, nothing has changed. We've given those who have to make those changes a couple of years to make the necessary changes. But again, this is a safety-related issue.
The New York Times reported today that the head of Boeing made a personal call to President Trump about this matter. Has Boeing made any representations to either you or anyone else?
Not to me personally, no.
David Akin, Global.
Good morning, Minister.
Good morning.
You mentioned a few minutes ago that, of course, the FAA is the certifying authority for this particular aircraft. And of course, we take the FAA's certification in this airspace. And I'd like you to comment on your confidence in the FAA as a certifying authority, given that it has 35 congressional mandates that are sitting unanswered right now. everything from seat space to secondary barriers protecting cockpits. The top job at the FAA has not been filled by President Trump. It remains open for 14 months. Enforcement fines against major U.S. carriers have dropped 88% in the last 2 years. How can Canadians have confidence that the FAA is doing what we expect it to do, which is certify safe aircraft?
I have the greatest respect for the Federal Aviation Administration. It has thousands of very competent professionals, aeronautical engineers, pilots, inspectors, people who do exactly the same thing as we do here at Transport Canada. They certified this aircraft. For example, to make a Canadian comparison, we certified the C-Series aircraft. If it was a C-Series that was involved in an accident, we would be leading in the investigation with the Transportation Safety Board if they decided that they would investigate that particular accident. It's a responsibility of the certifying authority. My knowledge of the FAA is an extremely professional organization. I can't comment on all of the things that you spoke about, but with respect to safety, we are very, very comfortable with the fact that they are a certifying agency, and they're very comfortable with the fact that we are a certifying agency for the Global Express or the C-Series or helicopters that we certify here in Canada.
Just to follow up a little more on the data that you analyzed, if you could just give me a sense, was it just Canadian flight data that you were looking at and examining, or all flights of 737s in Canadian airspace? Just a little more on the data set, and whether or not you had any reports from Canadian operators that we saw from the United States, where some United States pilots reported to NASA where they had to disengage the autopilot on a 737 to account for some strange things. Did you address those two issues?
Yes. We asked, or I asked specifically a couple of days ago about whether there had been any reports of MCAS anomalies and disengaging, because our Canadian pilots have been given additional training. In fact, I think we've had the most focused approach on what to do if this were to happen on a Canadian aircraft. And I'm very comfortable with the fact that our Canadian pilots know exactly what to do in such a situation. The answer is no, there have not been any reports from the three airlines that we asked on the particular question. And I forgot the first part of your question.
Just about the data set.
Oh, yes, the data set. What we looked at this morning was simply the profile in about the first 10 minutes of the flight of the Ethiopian airline when it took off from Addis Ababa, and we also drew up the same profile for the Lion Air one out of Indonesia, so that we could have a basis for comparison, and that's all we looked at.
So sorry, maybe I missed it. Then you compared those two flights against what?
Against what we know to be a normal situation when an airplane takes off. When an airplane normally takes off, and you've done it many, many times, you're not normally exposed to vertical fluctuations.
Right, so you're saying to Canadian flights taking off, 737?
Or most normal flights in the world.
Right, I'm sorry. We had the Lion Air, and you're trying to compare against. You looked at a bunch of Canadian flights?
No, we just looked at the Ethiopian flight. Looking at the Ethiopian flight and comparing it to the Lion Air flight. Do you follow me? And the anomalous behavior of both. We know what happened with the Lion Air flight, so we wanted to see whether the Ethiopian flight resembled it.
McKenna,
does that answer your question? We can talk offline. Yeah.
You said that it was based on new information was the reason for the decision. On Monday, as you know, Boeing announced that it was making a major software upgrade to the autopilot system to make the aircraft safer. Was that not enough information to make a decision? Clearly that there was a software upgrade that was coming that was not there yet for all these planes. And secondly, what guarantees will you provide to Canadians that they'll be maintained financially whole by any disruptions in travel over the next little while?
So on the first part of your question, Remind me again, sorry, because I was getting onto the finance. Oh, yeah, Monday, yeah. So they were talking about a software fix that was put into motion after the Lion Air incident that occurred in October. So this was not in response to what happened in Ethiopia. This was something that they had, after the investigation of the Lion Air incident, decided that they were going to make a software patch to the system as it existed at the time of the Lion Air. And all MAX 8 airlines will be incorporating that patch. So that's a patch that has been in development to address a specific problem that occurred last October, and that will be put in place in the coming weeks in all MAX 8 aircraft, no matter from what country. With respect to the financial question, is your question more focused on the airlines, or is it on the passengers? Well,
the decision is yours to ground the planes. Mm-hmm. It creates a cascading effect of disruptions, and you're going to have a lot of people that are going to be put out, have to be put up in hotels, disrupted. What guarantees do they have from the federal government that they'll be financially whole for all that disruption?
There are no guarantees. These things happen, and normally when we're talking about a situation such as that, it is up to the passengers and the service providers, the airlines, to try to find a solution to the situation. But we have to be focused on the security, the safety side of the issue.
Okay, we have about 10 more minutes. Carl Mayer.
Thanks. Minister, there was a report about pilots voicing safety concerns about the MAX 8 for several months. One captain was calling the flight manual inadequate and almost criminally insufficient. Has Canada had any similar reports from complaints from our pilots?
No, as I said, we have not, and from any of the airlines. And in fact, we took the initiative after this incident of actually doing more than came from Boeing and the FAA. We decided to put some additional training in and some additional flight procedures changes as well to make sure that we addressed comprehensively what a pilot might have to do if an exactly similar situation occurred as occurred with the Lion Air aircraft. And our airlines have told us, and our pilots and the pilot associations, that that has worked well.
Mr. Garneau, you received no complaints from pilots, but on the U.S. side, the American media are talking about at least 5 reports in the last year. This morning, there were 2 reports of technical problems. The last was in December, and that triggered an emergency notice. Were you not aware of these incidents? I am aware of everything that's going on in Canada, because every time there is an anomaly in a flight or in rail transportation or transportation by ship, I receive that information. But the vast majority of people are not aware that from time to time this type of incident occurs, and that often no one is necessarily aware of the fact. But you know that occasionally a flight needs to deviate from its flight path to land in a different place, but we need to be careful. You need to look at the reason. This morning we're talking about the issue of what the explanation is for the Ethiopian Airlines flight, and people are wondering whether comparisons can be drawn with the Indonesian crash. We have absolutely no certainty of what's happened with Ethiopian Airlines, but for Lion Air in Indonesia, this type of incident has not occurred based on our data here in Canada. other types of incidents with Boeings. That's always possible that an aircraft has a problem. It occurs from time to time. And it's something that we are informed of. And when there is cause to do so, the Transportation Safety Bureau can conduct an investigation, and secondly, we take measures as well. Most of the time, it's invisible to the public.
Usually we are in lockstep with the FAA for good reason. Can you just talk a little bit about whether we have ever been out of lockstep with the FAA on something like this, and maybe how much that weighed on your decision today, whether to order the planes essentially out of Canadian skies?
I would say that we work extremely well together. I can't tell you whether we've occasionally had differences of opinion, but it's obvious that with so many flights that fly between our two countries, and because of our natural affinity for each other as two countries, that we adopt a very, very similar approach. But having said that, we make our own decisions in Canada, and occasionally those decisions may be different from our colleagues south of the border, and they're aware of it and the reasons for it, and similarly they let us know when they have a difference of opinion. But I would say the relationship, the working relationship, and the similarities between our regulations is extremely high.
Just to clarify, you talked about the threshold for safety, and that this went over that threshold that you have. What is it that you need to see from either Boeing, from the airline? What is it that you need to see to bring that threshold down and basically lift this order?
So the evidence. We're waiting to see what is.
I mean, what specifically in the evidence do you need to see? What do you need to hear that says this plane is safe to go up again?
The smoking gun that will explain what happened with this particular flight, and we're hopeful that the voice and data recorders will provide that information, and we're optimistic that they will. But they have to bring the machines to the place where they download the data. They have to listen to it. They have to look at the data. And we'll find out hopefully in the coming days how that aircraft behaved. And there's a lot of data that is gathered, and it will probably indicate the likely reason that this accident happened.
Shannon from Maclean's.
This new satellite data that you got, where did it come from, and what's the mechanism through which it's distributed to other countries?
Well, air traffic controllers around the world use data for places where they're over the ocean, that kind of thing, and so there is a capability that exists to provide reasonably detailed data from satellite providers, and they work with organizations like NAVCAN. They work with organizations, air traffic controllers in different countries to provide that additional level of detail, and so that's where this information comes from.
But you indicated earlier that this information is also available to other countries in some capacity, so that's what I was trying to understand.
Yeah, I think other countries use
Canadian body, or is this distributed internationally?
No, I think it's distributed. The satellite providers have arrangements with individual countries to provide that information as to supplement their air traffic control information.
Just a few more minutes. Let's stick to one question, no follow-up, please. Ken?
Ken Holt from Skies. Minister, presuming Boeing is able to deliver the software patch by, quotes, April, whenever that means, what's the procedure going forward from that point, once the airline, the carriers have that patch in place?
If I may, again, as the minister's noted, we're going to have to take an evidence-based approach to this. So part of trying to understand what happened in Ethiopia is to understand to what extent the software patch would help address that. And they'd have to go through a normal certification process that our flight test engineers would be involved in to determine whether or not that software patch is sufficient to bring their... Well, we're waiting for the software patch to be, so we're a little bit dependent on the manufacturer to bring that information to us, but our flight test engineers will be engaged on that.
Julie?
Minister, I heard you in French talking about the plane nosing down, and it sounds like a software glitch. I mean, we don't know the exact reason, but in both cases, it sounds like two brand new planes crashed into the ground just minutes after they went up in the air. I mean, doesn't this aren't Canadians, what are we supposed to think of this?
That's a very thin amount of information on which to base a decision that the two are identical. There are lots of reasons why aircraft can run into difficulties. So I really do urge you not to, and the public, to jump to any conclusions. Yes, it was a clear day. Yes, an experienced pilot. Yes, it happened within 10 minutes. But we don't know why the Ethiopian aircraft behaved the way it did. We don't even know precisely what happened with it. And that's what we want to get to the bottom of. And so it would be a mistake to oversimplify and say, oh, it looks exactly like the one that happened with Lion Air.
Worried enough to ground them.
It crossed a threshold in our minds in terms of the profile, and so we're at this point that triggered our decision to put a safety notice out. Yeah.
Kevin, Sidi?
Okay, we have information that there's max 8 planes in the air right now heading into Canadian airspace. Will they be diverted, or they'll be allowed to complete their flight?
They'll be allowed to complete their flights.
Can I just, you said it in French, can I just get you to say in English, explain what it is exactly, the similarities that you saw between the Lion Air and the Ethiopian Air?
Okay, so when an airplane takes off and climbs, there is a sensor, there's more than one, called an angle of attack sensor that essentially measures the attitude of the aircraft, how high, how steeply is it climbing, how shallow. And if you lift up the airplane too high, it can stall. So the angle of attack sensor was faulty on the Indonesian flight and essentially gave the impression that the nose was too high. And so the software, it's called MCAS software, said, oh, I better get the nose down, and it can actually force the nose down. And the pilot said, no, it's not too high. So he countered that. And then a number of seconds later, the MCAS software kicked in again and tried to force it down again. And he said, no, I got to climb. And eventually, unfortunately, the pilot lost that fight with this software. And that is what happened with the Lion Air. So the result there is that the airplane tends to oscillate in this conflict between the software and the pilot. And that's what had some similarities on the Ethiopian flight.
David?
Yeah, just one quick one. I've just been put some words in your mouth, if you'll pardon me this. There's nothing
you sometimes do, David, but that's okay.
There's nothing the Americans know that Canada doesn't. And everybody's working off the same information. The Americans would have this information about flight profiles. You've got all the information the Americans have. The difference in response, we chalk it up essentially to a judgment call. Would that be fair, that you've had the same data and have taken some steps based on a different judgment call than the FAA? Would that be, that's, I guess.
So all I can say, David, is we got this data this morning, analyzed it, and made a decision. I can't tell you for sure if the FAA has the data, but we are in touch with them, and so they will know by now, and they have to make their own decisions about whether they feel that in comparing the flights, whether that is a threshold point for them.
What do you know that the Americans do not know? Anything?
All I can say is that based on the new information that we got this morning, that was enough to cause us to make this decision. The Americans will do their own thing, and of course we need to get to the bottom of this with eventually the recorders.
That's all the time we had this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.